The clinking of silver against porcelain was the only sound that felt real. Across the polished mahogany table, my mother-in-law, Eleanor, was telling a story about a charity auction, her diamonds catching the light of the crystal chandelier above. My husband, Leo, sat beside me, nodding and smiling, while his brother, Julian, swirled the wine in his glass, looking bored. My father-in-law, Arthur, was silent, as usual, a ghost at his own table. On the surface, it was just another Sunday lunch with my wealthy in-laws, stiff, formal, and utterly draining. But I was used to that. I had learned to play my part, to smile and nod and pretend I belonged. Then I felt a soft buzz in my lap. I glanced down, keeping my face perfectly pleasant, and saw my phone screen light up. It was a text from an unknown number. I discreetly slid the phone under the edge of the heavy tablecloth. My smile didn't fade as my thumb tapped the screen. The message was short, only 6 words, but they made the air in my lungs turn to ice. Don't react. They're recording you. For a second, the world went quiet. The sound of Eleanor's voice, the clinking of the silverware, it all faded into a dull hum. A cold dread washed over me, so intense it felt like I'd been plunged into a frozen lake. My smile felt like a mask that had been glued to my face, stiff and unnatural. I wanted to gasp, to look around, to search for a hidden camera, but the message held me in place. Don't react. My hands, hidden beneath the table, began to tremble uncontrollably. I clasped them together, digging my nails into my palms to keep them still. Who sent this? And why were they recording me? My mind raced, but nothing made sense. I looked up and met Leo's eyes. He gave me a warm, loving smile, the same one that had made me fall for him. But now it looked different. It looked like part of a performance. I forced my own smile to widen, even as panic began to bubble inside me. I needed more information. Pretending to adjust my napkin, I risked another look at my phone, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't just the text. It was the call log. Stacked above the message were 114 missed calls from the same unknown number. 114. It wasn't a warning. It was a desperate, frantic scream for help that I hadn't heard. The sheer number made my heart pound against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't about catching me in a lie or making fun of me. This was something else entirely. And that's when I realized I wasn't supposed to survive this lunch. It had all started that morning, with a tenderness from Leo that now seemed sinister. He'd woken me up with coffee in bed, kissing my forehead and telling me how much he loved me. His affection felt a little too loud, a little too bright. Then he'd given me a gift, a beautiful deep blue dress. "Wear this to lunch, Clara," he'd said, his voice smooth as silk. "My mother will absolutely love it." It was a bit tighter than I usually wore, the fabric clinging in a way that made me feel exposed. At the time, I thought he was just being sweet. Now I wondered if the dress had been chosen for a reason. When we arrived at the restaurant, Eleanor greeted me with a smile that never reached her cold, calculating eyes. "Clara, dear," she'd said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "that dress is very bold. It's good to see you trying." It was a classic Eleanor compliment, a beautiful flower with a poisonous thorn. Julian had just smirked while Arthur gave a silent, almost invisible nod. The tension was there from the start, a low hum of disapproval I had learned to ignore. But now, sitting at the table with the knowledge that I was being recorded, that low hum had become a deafening alarm. Every polite question felt like an interrogation, every smile a threat. My smile didn't fade, but behind it, I was screaming. I was in a trap, and the people who were supposed to be my family were the ones who had set it. My heart was a drum beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I needed to get away from the table, away from their watchful eyes. I took a slow, deliberate sip of water, placed the glass down with a hand I prayed wasn't shaking, and forced a small, apologetic smile. "You'll have to excuse me for a moment," I said, my voice sounding surprisingly steady. Leo looked at me, his brow furrowed with fake concern. "Are you all right, darling?" he asked. I just nodded, pushing my chair back and walking towards the restrooms on legs that felt like jelly. Each step was a battle, a conscious effort not to break into a run. The walk across the restaurant felt a mile long, the eyes of the other diners feeling like 100 tiny spotlights. The moment I was inside the cool marble restroom, I stumbled into the nearest stall and locked the door. The click of the lock was the first moment of safety I'd felt since the text arrived. I leaned my head against the cold wall, taking a deep, shuddering breath. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold my phone. I pulled it out, my eyes immediately drawn to the call log. 114 missed calls. I tapped on the number, and a name I hadn't seen in over a year appeared on the screen. Nina. Nina. Leo's older sister. The one the family never spoke about. She had been cast out years ago for falling in love with someone the family deemed unsuitable. Eleanor had cut her off completely, forbidding anyone from contacting her. Nina was the family's ghost, a warning to anyone who dared to step out of line. And she had been trying to warn me. Desperately. My thumb hovered over the callback button. I had to know what was happening. I pressed it, my ears straining to hear a ring. Nothing. Just dead silence, followed by a soft beep and the words, "Call failed," flashing on my screen. I tried again. And again. The same result. It was like trying to shout in a vacuum. They weren't just recording me, they were controlling my communication. They had isolated me. A wave of pure panic washed over me, and I sank down onto the closed toilet seat. My mind started to spin, pulling up memories I had tried to bury. I remembered all the little cuts, the 1,000 tiny ways Eleanor had tried to make me feel small. She criticized the way I dressed, the way I spoke, the family I came from. Julian was more direct, with his sneering jokes about my middle-class background and how I didn't have the right breeding for the family. They were obsessed with their bloodline, their legacy, this unbroken chain of wealth and power that I had apparently contaminated. Then, a more recent memory surfaced, sharp and clear. It was about a month ago. I was walking past Leo's study late at night and heard his mother's voice sharp and angry. "She will not get a penny of this family's money, Leo. I don't care what you promised her," she had hissed. They were talking about the prenuptial agreement, a document I had refused to sign. It wasn't about the money. It was about the trust. I loved Leo, and I thought he loved me. Signing a paper that treated our marriage like a business deal felt wrong. I remembered Leo's voice, low and soothing, trying to calm his mother down. "I'll handle it, Mother," he had said. "I promise you, I will handle it." At the time, I thought he meant he would convince me. I thought he was defending our love. But sitting there, in the cold silence of the restroom, his words echoed in my mind with a new, terrifying meaning. They couldn't write me out of the family fortune through legal papers. So they had found another way, a permanent way. In their world, problems weren't solved. They were removed. My refusal to sign that document wasn't just an insult. It was a threat to their empire. And Leo, my loving, charming husband, had promised his mother he would handle the threat. He wasn't trying to convince me, he was going to eliminate me. I took one last look at my pale, frightened face in the mirror, then pushed the image away. Panic was a luxury I couldn't afford. If I was going to get out of this, I needed to be smart, not scared. I had to go back to that table and play my part. I smoothed down the blue dress Leo had given me, the dress that now felt like a costume for my own execution, and put the mask of a happy, loving wife back on. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic prisoner, but on the outside, I was calm. I was an actress, and this was the most important performance of my life. Walking back to the table was like wading through thick mud. Every head I passed seemed to turn and watch me. The air felt heavy, charged with a silent electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand up. When I reached the table, Leo stood up, pulling my chair out for me. Such a gentleman. "Feeling better?" he asked, his voice a warm caress that now sent a shiver of pure ice down my spine. "Much better, thank you," I replied, my voice light and airy. I sat down, my senses on high alert. I was a fox in a den of wolves, and I had to find their trap. Eleanor was now talking about a recent trip to Paris, her words flowing smoothly, but her eyes kept flicking over to me, sharp and assessing. Julian smirked into his wine glass, a cruel, knowing look on his face. Arthur was still silent, his expression unreadable. They were all watching me. The text message was right. But where was it? Where was the camera? My eyes scanned the room discreetly. Was it in the flower arrangement in the center of the table? Hidden in the light fixture above? No, that was too far away. It had to be close enough to capture my every expression, every word. It had to be aimed directly at me. My gaze drifted down to the table itself. The heavy white tablecloth draped all the way to the floor, creating a hidden world underneath. Of course, it would be under the table. But how could I look without giving myself away? I couldn't just bend down and peek. They would know something was wrong instantly. My mind raced, searching for a solution, a distraction. My eyes landed on my glass of water, still full, shimmering under the restaurant lights. An idea sparked. A desperate, risky plan. It was my only shot. I reached for my bread plate, my movements intentionally clumsy. My hand jerked, accidentally, knocking into the tall, slender water glass. Time seemed to slow down as it tipped over, sending a wave of ice-cold water cascading across the polished table. "Oh my goodness, I am so sorry," I gasped, jumping back as if startled. The effect was immediate. Chaos erupted. Eleanor let out a sharp cry of annoyance as the water pooled near her expensive handbag. Julian lurched forward, grabbing napkins to stop the flow. "Honestly, Clara," he muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. Even Arthur moved, dabbing at the spill with a napkin. In that brief moment of frantic movement, everyone was distracted. Everyone was looking at the mess. It was my chance. Leaning forward, pretending to help clean up the spill with my own napkin, I dropped it, by accident, on the floor. "Oh, clumsy me," I said to no one in particular. As I bent down to retrieve it, I forced my eyes to scan the dark underside of the table. And there it was. Taped to the bottom of the mahogany, almost directly in front of my seat, was a tiny, black device. It was no bigger than my thumb, but it held my entire world in its grasp, and in its center, a single, faint, blinking red light pulsed like a tiny, evil heartbeat. It was real. It was all real. I felt the air leave my lungs. I stayed crouched for a second too long, frozen by the sight. Before I could straighten up, a hand landed firmly on my back. I flinched. It was Leo. He leaned in close, his breath warm against my ear, his voice a low, dangerous whisper meant only for me. "Are you okay, darling?" His voice was full of concern, but his hand was not gentle. It was heavy, pressing me down, a silent command to stay in my place. His touch wasn't comforting. It was the hand of a jailer. In that single terrifying moment, I knew with absolute certainty that my loving husband was not just in on the plan. He was guarding me, making sure I couldn't escape. My blood ran cold. Leo's hand on my back was a brand, marking me as his prisoner. I straightened up slowly, the smile plastered on my face feeling brittle, like it could crack at any moment. I had to get out. Not just out of the restaurant, but out of this city, out of this life. But they were watching my every move. A mad dash for the door was impossible. Leo would have me back in my seat before I took 3 steps. Screaming for help was useless. They would paint me as a hysterical, unstable wife having a breakdown. I needed a way out that they couldn't stop. I needed a crisis they couldn't control. Just then, a waiter appeared at my elbow, placing a small, elegant plate in front of me. The appetizer, a single large shrimp, artfully arranged over a bed of greens. My mind, which had been spinning in a fog of terror, suddenly snapped into focus. An allergy. Years ago, I'd had a mild reaction to a bee sting and had been prescribed an allergy pen, an EpiPen, which I was told to carry for a while. I was pretty sure an old, expired one was still buried at the bottom of my purse. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot I had. They wouldn't want me to die at the table, would they? A public death would be messy. It would draw police, questions, attention. It was the one thing I thought Eleanor's precious family couldn't afford. I picked up my fork, my hand steady despite the storm raging inside me. I took a small bite of the shrimp. I chewed slowly, then swallowed. I waited a beat, letting the silence stretch. Then I let out a small cough, just a tiny tickle in my throat. Leo looked at me. "You okay?" I waved a hand dismissively. "Fine, just went down the wrong way," I rasped. I coughed again, this time a little harder. I let my eyes water, widening them slightly as I touched my throat. "It feels a little tight," I whispered, letting a note of real panic seep into my voice. This was it. The performance began. I started to cough more violently, each one a desperate hacking sound that drew the attention of the tables nearby. I clutched my throat, my knuckles white. I forced my breathing to become shallow, taking in short, sharp gasps for air. "I can't breathe," I wheezed, looking at Leo with what I hoped looked like pure terror. For a second, I saw a flicker of genuine panic in Julian's eyes. He jumped to his feet. "Her purse," he said, his voice high-pitched. "She has an allergy pen in her purse." He made a move to grab my handbag from the floor next to my chair. My plan was working. The chaos was starting. In another minute, someone would call an ambulance. I would be out. I would be free. But then, a voice cut through the noise, sharp and cold as steel. "Stay seated, Julian." It was Eleanor. She hadn't moved a muscle. She sat perfectly still, her face a mask of cold indifference. Her command was quiet, but it had the force of a gunshot. Julian froze instantly, his hand hovering in the air. He looked at his mother, then slowly he sat back down. Leo, who had been half standing, also sank back into his chair. Arthur remained a statue, and they just watched me. My feigned gasps for air caught in my throat, replaced by a surge of real, suffocating fear. They weren't going to help. They weren't going to let Julian get the pen. They weren't going to call for a doctor. They were just going to sit there and watch me die from a tragic, unforeseen allergic reaction. My plan hadn't just failed. It had backfired in the most horrifying way possible. I had handed them the perfect, blameless weapon to get rid of me. My escape plan had become my death sentence, and I was trapped at the table with my own executioners, who were patiently waiting for the final act. My act was becoming terrifyingly real. The feigned gasps for air were now mixed with genuine, ragged breaths of panic. My vision started to tunnel, the edges blurring into darkness, leaving only the three faces of my jury and executioners in sharp, cruel focus. Eleanor's expression was one of mild boredom, as if she were watching a play she'd seen a dozen times before. Julian had a smug, satisfied look, enjoying the show. And Leo, my husband. His face was a blank canvas, wiped clean of all emotion. He was simply waiting for it to be over. Hope, which had flared so brightly just moments before, was now extinguished, leaving behind the cold ash of despair. This was how I would die. Not with a bang, but with a pathetic, staged whimper at a fancy restaurant, surrounded by people who hated me. My body felt heavy, my limbs like lead. The performance was draining the last of my strength. I was ready to give up, to let the darkness take me. Then, a voice cut through the suffocating silence. "Eleanor, for heaven's sake, she's turning purple." It was Arthur, my quiet, invisible father-in-law, who I hadn't heard speak more than 3 consecutive sentences in the entire time I'd known him. His voice was low but firm, and it sliced through the tension at the table like a blade. Eleanor's head snapped toward him, her eyes flashing with fury. For the first time, I saw a crack in her perfect icy composure. She had been defied. Before she could speak, Arthur pushed his chair back and stood up, his movements surprisingly decisive. His face, usually a mask of quiet indifference, was etched with what looked like genuine alarm. "I'm taking her outside for some air," he announced, not asking for permission. He was at my side in an instant, his hand taking my arm. His grip was shockingly strong, not the frail touch of an old man, but the firm, unyielding hold of someone with a hidden resolve. He pulled me gently to my feet. My legs were unsteady, and I leaned on him, the act of a dying woman now a necessity. "Come on, my dear," he said, his voice loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Let's get you out of this stuffy room." Leo started to rise, a protest forming on his lips, but Arthur shot him a look of such command that my husband froze and sank back into his seat. Without another word, Arthur began guiding me away from the table, his body shielding me from the others. The short walk toward the restaurant's grand entrance felt like an eternity. My head was spinning, a mix of real fear and the lingering act of suffocation. Why was he doing this? Was this part of the trap? A different, more private way to finish the job? We were halfway to the door, passing by a large potted fern that momentarily hid us from the view of the table. Arthur leaned in close, his mouth next to my ear. His voice was no longer the concerned tone he used for the public. It was a low, urgent whisper that sent a jolt of electricity through my entire body. "It's not an allergy," he breathed, his words fast and sharp. "They poisoned your wine." The world stopped. Poison. The word echoed in the sudden, silent space in my mind. The tightness in my chest, the difficulty breathing. It wasn't all an act. The poison was real. He wasn't finished. His grip tightened on my arm, pulling me forward. "The coughing was a good distraction, but you need the antidote," he whispered urgently. "It's in your purse. Nina put it there. I'll create a diversion. Get ready." My mind reeled. Nina. Arthur. An antidote. The pieces of the puzzle were flying at me, rearranging themselves into a picture far more sinister and complex than I could have ever imagined. The threat wasn't just a recording, it was a slow-acting poison designed to kill me right under their noses. And my only ally, the man now guiding me toward a slim chance of survival, was the last person on Earth I ever would have expected. The cool night air hit my face, a stark contrast to the stuffy, poisoned atmosphere of the restaurant. But I could barely feel it. Arthur's words were a roaring fire in my mind. Poisoned. Antidote. Nina. The world outside was a blur of city lights and distant traffic, my head swimming in a dizzying fog. Arthur's hand was still on my back, a steady, grounding pressure. We were barely through the revolving doors when he let go of me and took 2 aggressive steps toward a young waiter who was collecting menus from an outdoor table. He didn't just argue. He erupted. "Is this what you call service?" Arthur's voice boomed across the patio, startling the waiter and turning the heads of several nearby patrons. "My daughter-in-law is ill and your staff stands around like statues. I want to see your manager now." It was a masterful performance. His face was red, his voice filled with righteous indignation. He was creating the perfect diversion, a loud, angry scene that drew every eye toward him and away from me. This was my chance. Leaning against the cold brick wall of the restaurant for support, I fumbled with the clasp of my purse. My fingers felt thick and clumsy, my movements slow and uncoordinated. The poison was working, making my limbs feel heavy and my thoughts sluggish. "Hurry, Clara, hurry!" I dug past my wallet, my keys, a tube of lipstick, my fingers searching for the familiar hard plastic case of the EpiPen. Then I felt it. I pulled it out, my heart leaping into my throat. And just as Arthur had said, there was something else. Taped securely to the side of the pen with a strip of black electrical tape was a small glass vial, no bigger than my pinky finger. Inside was a clear liquid. The antidote. Nina. She had somehow known. She had planned for this. She had given me a fighting chance. My hands were shaking so violently I was afraid I would drop it. I tore the vial free from the pen, the tape sticky and stubborn. I didn't hesitate. I twisted off the small cap and threw my head back, swallowing the contents in one desperate gulp. The liquid was bitter, with a sharp chemical taste, and I choked it down, praying it would work. For a moment, nothing. The dizziness remained. The world still tilted on its axis. Arthur was still shouting at the now flustered restaurant manager. Then a strange warmth spread through my chest, a tingling clarity that began to push back against the suffocating fog in my mind. The restaurant doors burst open again, slamming against the wall with a loud bang. Leo and Julian stormed out, their faces masks of fury. The act was over. The loving husband was gone, replaced by a stranger with cold, dead eyes. "What do you think you're doing?" Leo snarled, his voice low and menacing. He lunged forward and grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh like claws. His grip was meant to hurt, to control, to drag me back into the darkness. But the warmth in my chest was now afire. Strength, hot and fierce, flooded my veins. The dizziness was receding, replaced by a surge of adrenaline and pure, undiluted rage. I looked him dead in the eye, and with a force that surprised even me, I ripped my arm from his grasp. The fear was gone, burned away by a cold, hard fury. "I know everything, Leo," I said, my voice steady and sharp, cutting through the night air. The shock on his face was my first taste of victory. He stared at me, speechless, his plan crumbling before his eyes. At that exact moment, a sound sliced through the tension, the high-pitched screech of tires on asphalt. A dark sedan swerved violently to the curb, its headlights pinning us in their glare. The passenger door swung open with a thud, and a figure emerged into the bright light. It was Nina. Her face was grim, her eyes locked on us, filled with a cold, steely determination. The confrontation was here, and the cavalry had just arrived. Nina stepped out of the car and into the harsh glare of the headlights, a warrior stepping onto a battlefield. She held up her phone, and a voice sliced through the night, a voice I knew better than my own. It was Eleanor's, cold, precise, and utterly chilling, captured on a recording. "Once the poison does its work, it will be quick," Eleanor's recorded voice echoed on the silent sidewalk. "We move her to the car. The note is already prepared, confessing to the embezzlement we've fabricated. A tragic suicide driven by guilt, so much cleaner than a messy divorce." The sound stopped, but the words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. The full, monstrous plan was laid bare. They weren't just going to kill me. They were going to destroy my name, framing me as a criminal to protect their fortune and their reputation. Leo stared at the phone, his face ashen. He turned to his mother, who had now emerged from the restaurant, drawn by the commotion. She stood there regal and composed even as her empire crumbled around her. "Mother?" Leo stammered, his voice cracking. You said it was just to scare her into signing the papers." Eleanor didn't even look at him. Her eyes, filled with a venomous hatred, were locked on her daughter. "You were always a disappointment, Nina," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion except contempt. Then, she finally glanced at her son. "And you are a weak, sniveling boy. You were never strong enough for this family." That's when Arthur stepped forward, positioning himself between me and his wife. "I couldn't let you do it, Eleanor," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of years of silence. "Not again." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a deep, ancient sadness. "She reminded me of Nina. I watched you break one good person to protect your secrets. I wouldn't let you destroy another." The confession hung in the air, the final betrayal of Eleanor's iron rule. Julian, seeing it all fall apart, lunged for Nina's phone, a desperate, wild animal. But Nina was faster. She sidestepped him easily, her expression never changing. "It's not just this recording, Julian," Nina said, her voice ringing with authority. "I have everything. Years of it. I've been working with your former head of security for months, the man you fired because he grew a conscience. We have the offshore accounts, the blackmail files on your business partners, the evidence of every crime you committed to build this legacy on a foundation of lies. She took a step forward, and for the first time I saw the entire family flinch. They were powerless. The money, the influence, the name. It was all worthless against the simple, undeniable truth. And then we heard it. A faint sound at first, a distant wail that grew steadily louder, closer. The sound of approaching sirens. Nina lowered her phone and gave a small, grim smile. "It's over," she said. The news called it the fall of an empire. The trial was a media circus, detailing the spectacular downfall of a family that had seemed untouchable. Nina's evidence was a tidal wave that washed away all their power. Leo, broken and pathetic, testified against his mother in exchange for a lesser sentence. Julian was defiant until the end, cursing Nina's name. Arthur, having cooperated fully, was granted immunity and disappeared from public life. And Eleanor, even in a prison jumpsuit, remained as cold and unrepentant as she was at that lunch, defeated but never truly broken. As for me, I was no longer the timid woman who smiled to keep the peace. The fire they had tried to extinguish had instead forged me into something stronger. I stood on a cliff overlooking the ocean a year later, the wind whipping through my hair, the air clean and fresh. I was free. The money, the lies, the poison. It was all a story from another lifetime. I had survived their lunch, and in doing so, I had discovered a strength I never knew I possessed. I was no longer a character in their dark fairy tale. I was the author of my own,